at the world. So many joys and wonders, so many miracles along our way. Praise to thee, O Lord, for all creation. Give us thankful heart that we may see all the gifts we share and every blessing. All things come of thee.
Grace and peace to you from the one who came to raise the dead and the living dead. Amen. Where should one begin when talking about the theme of humility in our scriptures? The first letter of Peter might be a good place. The writing is credited to the Apostle Peter, or at least the very community that will have valued his example and teaching. And according to our gospel stories, was Peter's spiritual formation not very much about learning humility by trusting a greater love and story, which does not look for perfection, but compassion. All of you, clothe yourself with humility toward one another, because God opposes the proud, but shows favor to the humble. Humble yourselves, therefore, under God's mighty hand, that he may lift you up in due time. The idea of clothing ourselves with humility, to encourage a kind attitude or mindset in relation to other people, is a beautiful metaphor. Clothes protect and dignify. They can also indicate one's status or profession. But in this instance, they are meant to signal one of the gifts of the Spirit. But what do we mean by humility? The Greek term could also be translated with modesty or meekness. But even these English terms can carry different associations, ranging from being servile and submissive to being generous in affirming others and being willing to learn from them. We therefore have to be quite clear. The Christian virtue of humility, meekness or modesty comes with a complicated baggage. How did Christians manage to confuse humility with encouraging self-degradation and tolerating humiliation? Excessive humility or modesty can result in damaged self-worth, denying one's value and downplaying one's strengths. It can lead to an inferiority complex and make one vulnerable to people who are self-centered and manipulative, taking advantage of one's insecurity. And self-imposed modesty can also lead to envy and resentment when one's service for others is not being recognized and appreciated. First Peter adds another potentially problematic and damaging layer to our understanding of humility by encouraging the community to humble themselves under God's mighty hand. Is it the hand that is ready to strike and discipline us, or the hand that is committed to hold and protect us? In a world where might is often used to make things right, no matter how abusive or violent, the image of God's mighty hand does not necessarily inspire feelings of trust and safety. On the other hand, for the oppressed and exploited, God's mighty hand has always offered a level of hope and comfort. One day, the powerful will be held accountable and put into their place. It is interesting to note that in the Hebrew Bible, the metaphor of God's powerful hand is especially evoked in the context of the Exodus, the Hebrews' liberation from the Egyptian slave house. God is said to have liberated the enslaved with a strong hand and an outstretched arm. The pharaohs of today need to know that God's hand takes sides. It is the hand of the one who hears the cries of the oppressed and exploited. And yet such pedagogy of fear banking of threats of violent intervention and punishment, always runs the risk of being abused. In some Christian circles, corporal punishment at home or in schools is still justified with biblical references. God's mighty hand becomes the disciplining hand of the parent or teacher. I'm reminded of a very scary fairy tale from the Brothers Grimm collection, numbered 117, entitled The Willful Child. Once upon a time there was a child who was willful and would not do what her mother wished. For this reason God had no pleasure in her and let her become ill, and no doctor could do her any good. And in a short time she lay on her deathbed. When she had been lowered into her grave, and the earth was spread over her, all at once her arm came out again and stretched upwards. And when they had put it in and spread fresh earth over it, it was all to no purpose, for the arm always came out again. Then the mother herself was obliged to go to the grave and strike the arm with a rod. And when she had done that, it was drawn in, and then at last the child had rest beneath the ground. Once upon a time. It is a dark and terrifying tale, quenching the healthy spirit of youthful defiance and rebellion. It is painful to imagine what such a story did to a child. What an oppressive image of God, and what a soul-destroying pedagogy of fear. How does one recover from such emotional and physical abuse? And how does one discover the freedom to be disobedient and non-compliant when it comes to standing up for oneself and for what one considers to be right and just? An honest discussion on Christian perceptions of what we understand humility, meekness, or modesty to be about is important. We might no longer tell our children such scary tales, but the moralistic undertones that expect willing compliance and quiet conformity are present throughout our tradition and have even found their way into what we consider innocent Christmas lullabies, like Away in a Manger, which closes by saying, "Bless all the dear children in your tender care, and fit us for heaven to live with you there." It is quite ironic that the dear Jesus is being asked to help children be fit for heaven. The Gospel of Luke introduces us to a very defiant, stubborn, and willful 12-year-old Jesus, who, according to all our Gospels, grew into a rebel who was everything but compliant and conforming. And yet, we would credit Jesus with being humble and modest. How does this go together? What if being fit for heaven is to understand that humility is not meant to undermine being assertive, standing up for oneself and others for the sake of life? Should one not understand the hope of resurrection also as the gift of a bold insurrection arising against the forces which resist change? And are they not all meant to rise to new life? The willful child, the heartless and helpless mothers and fathers, and also our image of a God who apparently condemns willful children to death. They are all meant to rise, stand up, and be allowed to live differently. This is why we should add the usual closing sentence to the fairy tale, which is missing in this particular tale. And if they haven't died, the child and the mother and the doctor, then they're still living today. Yes, they are still living today, but set free from the fear of not being good enough, of not being fit for heaven, of not being heard, affirmed, and encouraged to raise their hands in protest, and being lifted up by God's mighty hand.
Praise to thee, O Lord, for all creation. Give us thankful hearts that we may see all the gift we share and every
All of you, clothe yourself with humility toward one another, because God opposes the proud, but shows favor to the humble. Humble yourself, therefore, under God's mighty hand, that he may lift you up in due time. God's mighty hand plays a central role in 1 Peter's challenge to the proud and its affirmation of the humble. How are we to imagine the might of God's hand? Does Jesus' life and ministry not encourage us to think of divine power in you, less overpowering and more empowering images of human divine synergy? Turning to one of South Africa's great artistic souls might help the process of such creative and necessary reimagination. Jackson Hlungwane grew up in rural Limpopo, northern Mpumalanga. His father taught him to carve. In the 1940s, he was ordained as a lay preacher in the African Zionist Church. In 1978, he experienced a vision of Christ, which became a defining moment of his life and career as an artist. He became an independent preacher and formed his own church. He embraced an independent African-based Christianity that looked back to early Christian antecedents in Ethiopia. Hlungwane will have looked at a piece of wood and recognized its potential to become the hand of God. He chooses to sculpt the right hand of God, which in the Bible is the one known to intervene and save, to empower and help. The use of a body part to represent the whole is a synecdoche, a well-known figure of speech. Hlungwane allows himself to be guided by the growth patterns and life force that structure the timber. In what ways can Hlungwane's hand of God help us to recover other more liberating aspects of humility in relation to God's power? First of all, the hand is oversized and combined with an elongated wrist. The position of the right hand bending backwards on itself is unusual and for a human being anatomically impossible to achieve. This hand is not in a position of getting ready to strike. It is rather cupped as if wanting to protect a flame. This hand of God does not expect perfection, but encourages compassion with oneself. We are allowed to admit having made mistakes. We are empowered to learn from them. Our failing is one of failing forward. For only those not afraid of taking risks and making mistakes will be able to learn and grow. Does 1 Peter not promise along those lines that those who humble themselves will be lifted up? And was this not also the experience of the Apostle Peter? He knew about failing forward and the grace of being lifted up by the risen Christ at the Sea of Galilee. And we should note that 1 Peter did not expect the community, which was suffering severe persecution at the time, to humble themselves before any worldly powers and authorities. Their loyalty was to be to God only, and such loyalty was to protect their little flame in order to be able to resist those who make absolute claims on their lives. To humble oneself before God's mighty hand is then not about making oneself small, but rather about standing tall and boldly asserting one's God-given dignity. How could those aspects of humility be confused and mixed up? How did this false, one-sided image of humility as a form of servile submission gain such influence and traction? It might be because people misunderstood Jesus' own humility. The suffering Jesus became a guiding image for modesty, and it was interpreted in a very one-sided way, along the lines of a Jesus who submitted to the will of God by allowing himself to be handed over to the political and religious leaders of his time, willingly suffering torture and crucifixion without any resistance, as if God does not will life but death. This image is not only one-sided, but theologically also highly problematic. It does not just overlook the revolutionary aspects of Jesus' ministry, but it has also been abused to glorify quiet suffering of evil as a Christian virtue. Especially women were expected to endure abuse and violence for the sake of keeping the peace, as if taking up the cross is about silently and willingly suffering injustice. No, it is to resist evil and be willing to suffer the consequences for speaking out against injustice. To humble oneself under God's mighty hand is to not tolerate that the fists of the oppressor humiliate and injure the powerless. To suffer for other people can also be about standing up for them. This is, in fact, an important aspect of faith. It highlights the connection between humility and justice. It is not as obvious in 1 Peter, but resonates with the famous saying from the prophet Micah. God has shown you, O mortal, what is good. And what does the Lord expect of you? To act justly and love mercy and to walk humbly with your God. To humble oneself under God's mighty hand becomes a walking humbly with our God for the sake of justice and the love of mercy. Such humility is an affirmation of everything good and beautiful in a human being. It connects us with God as the ground of being. After all, the English word humility derives from the Latin word humus, which means ground or earth. To humble oneself is to ground ourselves in the source of all life and love. The second aspect of Hlongwani's hand of God, which stands out for me, is that the carved hand appears to us as though viewed through running water. Notice how the contours of the hand are softened, distorting the fingertips and nails. To humble ourselves under this hand of God is to recognize the invitation to cherish one's dependence on the greater flow of grace and enter the stream of justice. Humility, then, is more than just a virtue. It is a form of perception, a language in which the eye can hear the thou, the presence of divine love carved into a hand which protects our fragile flame and invites us to enter more fully into the flow of life. Such humility opens us to everything created. We notice the breath before the word, the song, the lament and praise. In humbling ourselves, we feel affirmed and enlarged, discovering our place in the family of all things. It is rather sobering to notice how much effort goes into helping us see what makes us different, special, or superior in comparison to others, whether as a social group, a race, a gender, or as individuals. This is not the way of humility. To humble ourselves under God's mighty hand is to see how it is cupped to protect the flame of life in all its different expressions. To humble ourselves under God's mighty hand is to see the invitation to enter the stream of life-giving grace. And so as you leave from here, God bless us as we humble ourselves under God's mighty hand, so that we will all be lifted up in due time. Amen.
Think of the spring, think of the warmth of summer, bringing the harvest before the winter storm. Everything grows, everything has a season, till it is gathered to the Father's throne. Praise to thee, O Lord, for all creation. Give us thankful hearts